Can we keep growing the human population, growing the size of our economy, adopt renewables like crazy, and have a stable climate?
Calling. Call a growth buster. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Welcome to the Growth Busters podcast. We are in overshoot. You know what that means? That means that the human race has outgrown the planet. But there are a number of things that we can do about it, and the reason we want to is so that our children and future generations have a shot at living decent lives. And that's what this podcast is about. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary Growth Busters, Hooked on Growth. You can learn about that and further explore the issues we talk about at growthbusters.org. And I'm joined today by my partner in growth busting, Dana Hickey.
Hi there.
How's it going?
Good. It's been
Good.
nice.
You might recall in our last episode, we talked about straws. That wasn't the only thing we talked about, but I did bring up the fact that I was going to do my best to eliminate disposable plastic straws from my life. And I have a quick follow-up on that, and that is that this news just crossed my desk last week, which is that McDonald's in Great Britain has decided that they are going to phase out disposable plastic straws, so that's pretty good news.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Fewer turtles hurt by straws.
Yeah, but it's interesting that they are not necessarily going to get rid of disposable straws. They're probably moving toward paper straws, which at least are recyclable and at least biodegradable and don't exist on the planet forever and ever and ever and turn into microplastic and get stuck in sea turtles' noses and all those other things, right? But it was kind of interesting. The story, it was a Reuters news story out of London, and they talked a little bit about what customers thought about it. And these were customers where paper straws were already in use. And I guess apparently there's some inconveniences associated with paper straws, that they get soggy if you take a long time to drink your drink. And
yeah, I've used some paper straws before, and it's interesting because they get very mushy with drinks, and especially if you try to drink in the smoothie or something, it seems like it doesn't work as well. But I remember when I got mine, I was really excited because it had a little quote about like saving the environment on it. And I was like, ooh, it's compostable. So some drawbacks, I guess, but then they're much cuter packaging usually. So that's nice.
And I hadn't thought about it, but I think when I was a kid, that's all we had was paper straws. You know, they hadn't come up with plastic straws yet. And that's all we knew. So we were fine.
That's a weird thing to think about, that it's like a different generation of like, I've only had the plastic straws, and then we think it's a novelty when we have other types. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, but I was glad to see that customers said, yeah, I think I can taste the paper a little bit. But by and large, they were willing to put up with those inconveniences in order to do away with the plastic. And that's pretty good because in so much of our talk, don't you think, about sustainability, that's one of the things we're up against is convenience. There are so many conveniences that make the human race less sustainable, and questions about whether we're willing to be inconvenienced by living more lightly on the planet.
Yeah, there's a lot of trade-offs whenever you have any single-use products. It is convenient that you have your items that you can throw away quickly, but then the convenience you have is not convenient for future generations or people. It's just what is in the moment. So
quite inconvenient, in fact, right? So enough about straws. What is going on in the world of sustainable living these days?
Well, June 1st was the one-year anniversary of Trump saying that he wanted to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So it's been an interesting year with what it's been a year ago and what he has said and what he's done in regards to climate and what the EPA has done. So we want to discuss kind of what changes have happened recently in regards to that.
Yeah, and first of all, a quick reminder to ourselves that the U.S. isn't out, that actually it'll be November 2020 before we're officially out. But of course, public policy at the White House is certainly not doing us any favors in terms of limiting emissions, right?
Yeah, because we're not officially out of it yet because it took a while to get into it, and then there's a lot of steps that have to be taken. But because Trump has said that he wants to withdraw from it, it's changed a lot of the mindset of our own policies inside the United States or anything related to climate, since he has that mindset. So not for the better, really.
Yeah, so that's some bad news, but I know you have some good news about that. But before we talk about that, I just have a little pet peeve about what he said when he made that announcement. And what he said was that voluntary deal, the Paris Climate Agreement aimed at curbing global temperature rise to under 2 degrees centigrade, he called it draconian and that it would cause a very diminished quality of life for Americans. And I just got to say, what about the diminished quality of life around the world, including Americans, will suffer if we don't do something, if we don't keep the global temperature rise under 2 degrees centigrade?
Yeah, he says it's going to degrade American quality of life, but when you compare our standards of living to almost every other country in the world, we are way above the average. So our poorest of the poor are living much larger than a lot of the richer people in other countries. So I think his perspective is a little skewed in what he thinks will happen. I feel like he says that it will affect negatively Americans, but it's like, how much will it really cause a difference, and will it actually be negative?
Are you saying because we live so well today, so what's the big deal if we don't live quite as well? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, kind of. I think we're just so used to, kind of referring back to our other podcast, living so large that we think that if we have to sacrifice a little bit, it will be a tremendous drain on us, I guess. But I think we don't realize that our lifestyle is a lot larger than it needs to be, and compared to other parts of the world, a lot of people live on a much smaller scale, or they don't need as many resources. And it's just the way that they're used to. But it's like how America, we supersize everything because that's just because we can. So he has that attitude that's what America's entitled to, I guess.
Well, that's a good point, and I don't dispute that at all. But my point really was a little different, which is, what about our quality of life if we go ahead and let climate disruption get out of hand? I mean, we're going to be seriously inconvenienced, even here in some of the richest parts of the world. We're still going to have significant sea rise in our coastal communities, and we're still going to have, just last year, we had 3 really devastating storms that impacted the United States, and that impacts our quality of life. That is a diminishment of quality of life. And what about potential starvation? Because if we let the global temperatures exceed 2 degrees centigrade rise, we're going to have problems with access to fresh water. We're going to have less access to food. Those are really significant, much more significant to our quality of life than the inconvenience of cutting our emissions.
Yeah. So some good news that has come up is that even though the United States as a federal establishment might not have the desire to be as connected to the agreement, a lot of local levels like state and even some businesses are trying to cut back on their emissions, which is really exciting because they want to have more of a united front, I guess, than we had as a country. They're saying we want to do this because we know it's the right thing to do, which I think is kind of cool.
Yeah, I think they were really inspired by the failure.
It's like the lack of action. They're like, okay, we're gonna do this.
Yeah, so I think they stepped up even more than they would have. And some examples would be, more than 80 U.S. cities have committed to 100% renewable energy. Several thousand businesses, including Amazon, Levi's, Google, have pledged to follow the Paris goals via the We Are Still In coalition.
It was interesting because one of the most iconic quotes that Trump said why he wasn't joining was that, I want to put America first and I want to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh and not Paris. And then, how the mayor of Pittsburgh, he said right after that, he would rather follow the guidelines of the Paris Agreement and because it's for our people, our economy, and our future. And now, if you look back at what they've done this year, they've also tried to limit their environmental impact. So it's like the city who Trump was trying to use as an example is like, no, we want to follow it. And they've done that. So I think that's a nice highlight that he's just not following correctly, I guess.
Yeah, and it's just amazing that just a few short years ago, climate change was still, being debated. There was still this fake debate about whether it was really real or not and whether it was human caused or not. And people in the United States were not energized about it at all. And now, it's pretty clear evidence here that we're through debating it, other than a few doofuses and some in policy-making positions that they do not deserve. Other than a few of those, everybody gets it. They know that it's a problem. I don't think people really realize how extreme the problem is. And one thing that I think is part of the problem is we get all these reports. Have you noticed this, Dana? Almost without fail, the headlines and even the news stories and the people talking about it, they're always talking about how many degrees Celsius the rise potentially could be. They never, even here in the United States where we're so backward and we just could not get around to adopting the metric system. So we still talk about temperature in the U.S. degrees Fahrenheit. Most people in the U.S. don't really have a appreciation for what 2 degrees centigrade is.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to resonate as much. It's like, oh, this is an overall thing. Okay, it's going to happen. And I feel like it would be more useful if they put it in standards that people would be able to understand. It's like, if this happens, then, the temperature rises, these other things will occur. It's a domino effect. And I think if they laid it out so that people could understand the actual impacts of it, it would be a lot more useful to get the idea across. But
very true. That would be helpful too. But I think if they just would convert to Fahrenheit and report it in Fahrenheit, it would get their attention, because what is 2 degrees Celsius? It's almost 4 degrees Fahrenheit. It's almost twice as much. And so every time we get a Celsius report in the U.S., people just naturally think in Fahrenheit. And so they cut it in half. They basically cut all the temperature reports that they're getting in half, just subconsciously. And so I don't think that helps. I've never heard anyone talk about that, and I don't know why that hasn't been considered. So I think it's interesting that we're getting bad news from the White House, but we're getting good news from all of these other organizations that are committed to doing the right thing. And we're even getting some good news in terms of some of the emissions reports, right? There was a story in the UK Guardian recently that told us that U.S. energy emissions are at a 25-year low due to trends in energy efficiency and the decline of coal. And the closure of coal plants in the U.S. has just been astonishingly fast. Never fast enough, but I've been really surprised at how fast we're just jettisoning coal. But it's interesting that the report also said that we need far deeper emissions cuts in order to avoid that 3.7 degrees Fahrenheit of warming that the Paris Climate Agreement is trying to avoid. And it also said that the U.S. is in danger of stalling, that by 2025 the U.S. is set to achieve only half the reductions that it pledged in Paris, according to a new analysis. So I guess even with all of those good-hearted people saying we're going to stick with the plans, it still doesn't look like we're going to do enough. We need to step it up even more.
Well, I feel like we've made a lot of the initial changes, switching from coal to maybe some more like natural gas or some more renewable resources, which is good. But I guess the lack of change later on that we predict might be because it will be harder to find more ways to switch over or get the initial people that have switched over to maybe persuade the other people. So that could be interesting to try to see what new ways people have to come up with to continue the drop. Because if you switch out power for some sources, if you switch to solar or wind, but then other sectors of the economy might not be as easily switched over. So maybe that's why there could be a lack of decrease in just a more positive change and accords.
I've long thought that a big part of the problem, of course, is that even though we are now finally, with the exception of the White House, willing and interested in addressing the problem, there's always one thing that we're not willing to give up. No matter what we're doing and no matter where we are in the world, there's one thing that policymakers will not give up in order to mitigate climate change, and that is economic growth. We are so obsessed with and in love with economic growth that we'll do everything we can to try to avoid climate catastrophe as long as it doesn't interfere with economic growth.
Yeah, I feel like our government and the White House is always at odds with, they want that economic growth because that's what his policies were started on. He wanted the businesses to grow. So
no one gets elected these days without promising economic growth, and no one will be elected in current conditions if they say, guess what, we can't have continued economic growth. I'm going to really make sure that future generations have a decent planet on which to live, and that means that we are going to stop trying to grow our economy. We're going to redefine what a healthy 21st century economy looks like, and it is not an ever-growing economy. It's an economy that meets our needs, and it does that without destroying our climate stability.
Yeah, that would be an interesting platform.
Yeah. Well, we need to get there somehow. Yeah. I know you remember well when Jimmy Carter was in the White House.
I don't
Not.
know. I was about to be like, I don't think so.
I don't think so. But Jimmy Carter was the last major politician who told us the truth. He dared to be really honest about the fact that we really needed to turn down the thermostat in winter and wear a sweater. We needed to really cut our fossil fuel appetite. And he said, and that's going to take some sacrifice. And I guess there's still some debate about it, but for the longest time, so many people have felt U.S. President Jimmy Carter screwed up because he told us those things, which were really the truth.
I thought his policies were a lot better, and it's interesting because some of my friends have met him, which I think is amazing. But it's interesting because his policies, like you said, were more straightforward. But I think people need that because now a lot of the policies are that it's like, oh, America is great. We are amazing. We're going to get this changed. And it's not being realistic in some aspects or a lot of aspects. Just sugarcoating everything is not necessarily helpful in situations like these where in order to cause real change, you can't say that everything is going to be all right, which is an interesting balance. Like you have to be optimistic that there will be change, but you can't say like if the current rate we're going, the Earth is still going to have the same temperature or still have all the resources, which, is not necessarily the case.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute because I've been thinking about that too in the last couple of days, that it seems that we're switching over to renewable energy faster than I thought we would. And certainly there's increased commitment to do that. And that's pretty impressive. When you look at the organizations out there who are really pushing hard and advocating for us to adopt renewables and to say goodbye to fossil fuels, and a lot of them are focused on avoiding the worst of climate change. They are all about climate change. None of them, I don't think any of them are talking about adopting a steady state economy or getting away from that number one public policy goal of economic growth. None of them are telling us that. And I think some of the leaders of those organizations probably understand that getting over our addiction to economic growth is going to be a necessary part of avoiding the worst of climate catastrophe. But they don't put that in their messaging because they really want us to move to renewables very quickly, and they fear, and maybe they even know, that if they tell us the full truth, if they say we need to adopt renewables quickly, but we can't keep having economic growth, that basically their audience would go away. They would lose us, just like Jimmy Carter lost so many of us when he told us the full truth. So I think they're intentionally withholding some of the most brutal part of the truth from us in order to get us to do something. Mm-hmm. And I guess it could be debated. I'd be interested to know what you think about that. But I think you just said that we really need to know the full brutal truth so that we will do what is necessary. And I see the wisdom of that.
Yeah, we might not need, I guess, the full truth because, if you've watched any science fiction movie or something, whenever that happens, people go crazy, I guess, because then they can't handle this terrible thing's going to happen.
Yeah.
So we don't want that happening. But I guess it would be better, maybe in my mind, it's just my opinion, just to have more clarity in what's actually happening, which I feel like a lot of times in the news, unless you dig deep to say, okay, what is the specific environmental news, you don't see the headlines of what's happening. And I guess we're just not told as much. I don't know if that makes sense. I feel like a lot of times when the politicians say, this is what's happening, they're not explicitly saying this is why it's happening or what could you do to make it better. And I guess it doesn't have to be a negative connotation that we're killing the earth, but maybe suggestions, okay, this is ways you can help make it better. So a more gentle push. I don't know if that makes sense.
But let's take 350.org as an example. They've had a pretty successful campaign to get people to move their investments out of fossil fuel businesses, and they are certainly pushing for adoption of renewable energy sources at the public policy level. But I don't ever hear them suggesting to the members or to the citizens of the planet to drive less or to turn their thermostat down in the winter or up in the summer, to ride their bicycle, things that individuals could do. They don't seem to be suggesting any individual action. I guess with a big organization like that, it might be their maybe
goal is to have, okay, we're going to tackle this sector of like, you want to, like, that could be their goal. But I think it is important to like also tell people to do those other things, even though they might not listen as much because it's harder changes to make, walking instead of driving or things like that. But I guess that organization might say, okay, this is what they know that they can tackle.
Yeah.
But those other parts still are helpful, I guess.
But I think part of it is that it's easy to categorize those things as sacrifices, and so that makes it a little harder for them to achieve their number one objective. My point that I've tried to make over and over again on the Growth Busters podcast is that it's not necessarily a sacrifice. There are a lot of joys that come along with skinnying up your life. I'm really enjoying riding my bicycle to meetings. And
I walk to work, and I like it. It's like a nice relaxing, like there and back, and you get to enjoy the temperature, see deer in the morning. That's always nice.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't think it's a sacrifice, but I think I've looked at it a lot longer and read a lot more, and for me, it's more of like, okay, I'm thinking holistically, like this is something that I would love to do to help the environment.
Well, let's do our part, see what we can do to help enlighten people a little bit. There's another item in the news that's related. There's a draft UN IPCC report that's scheduled for release in October, but a draft was recently made available, and it says that global warming is on course to exceed the most stringent goal set in the Paris Agreement by around 2040. And that stringent goal was 1.5 degrees centigrade, 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to try to always include Fahrenheit since I'm bitching about that little communication hurdle. So we're on course to exceed that 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. I guess that's why everybody's talking about now a 2 degrees Celsius or 3.7 degrees Fahrenheit goal, because apparently it's just not likely that we're going to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's really looking ever more unlikely that we're going to achieve the 2 degrees Celsius goal either. But interestingly, in this draft report, they do say, and this is, I'm quoting from a Reuters story that came out on June 14th, the report outlines one new scenario to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. For instance, in which technological innovations and changes in lifestyle could mean sharply lower energy demand by 2050, even with rising economic growth. So, kind of ticked off that rising economic growth isn't on the table as something that perhaps could go away. Kind of excited that they actually mentioned changes in lifestyle. I'd love to know what they're thinking about there. And maybe that's in the draft. I haven't found where that draft report is. But I thought it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about this technological innovations part of the deal.
Yeah, I'm curious kind of what technological innovations they want to happen. Like, do they have some in mind that they say, okay, the cleaner energy or better fuel efficiency or things like that sort of lane? Are they hoping that by 2050 there's going to be new technology that we have yet to think up? So it would be interesting to hear what their thoughts are on that.
Yeah, apparently they are not mentioning in this draft report the far-fetched geoengineering solutions. So it's a little bit more realistic kind of technological innovations. But I just want to talk briefly about this whole idea about, can we have an ever-growing economy and just power it with renewables, the number one technological innovation on everybody's mind these days? Can we do that and actually continue to reduce emissions? Can we keep growing the human population, growing the size of our economy, adopt renewables like crazy, and have a stable climate?
Well, it's interesting because, even if we say some miracle we had 100% renewable energy, but even with every renewable energy source, there's some drawback to them. So it's like you can't continually put solar panels up because some of the resources used to build them aren't necessarily things that are renewable. So even the energy is. I guess what I'm trying to say is, if people still want continual economic growth, and even if they had 100% renewable energy, it's not something that is possible still, I think. Because, you can't just have whole solar fields, you can't just have millions of wind turbines, you can't just have a lot of geothermal, because all those things have restrictions. So I think it's interesting that that's still not on the table of, limiting economic, because even in the best case scenario, which is 100% renewable energy, it's still limited.
Really makes me feel some hope to hear a young person like you who gets that. I'm going to give you an A+. If I was your college professor, it's a great, great answer. Many engineering types who've run the numbers tell us that we need fossil fuels in order to create the renewable infrastructure, in order to manufacture the wind turbines. and install those. And there's serious question about whether we can actually maintain them and replace them as they wear out on renewable energy alone. They're not going to generate enough energy to meet the needs of this crazy human population intent on ever expanding economy and keep replacing themselves just to power that. I think it leads me into the last thing that I really wanted to make sure we talked about today, and that is this idea that we can decouple emissions from economic activity, and so that ultimately we can have a lot of economic growth with lower and lower emissions. And, we've been experiencing a little bit of that. In the last decade, you can find a lot of examples where total carbon emissions have declined or maybe plateaued, even though the economy has continued to grow. And the people who think that all we need is more technological innovation tell us that is an example of decoupling.
Well, it's weird because I was talking to one of my friends who's a chemical engineer, so he's really researched a lot about CO2 emissions in the atmosphere because that's one of his focuses. And I think it's interesting because we focus on a lot about CO2 emission in the atmosphere, and that's like how we measure how well we're doing on environmental standards, which is, it's a good factor to look at because it affects a lot of things. But I don't think it accurately portrays, all the environmental impacts, even though we might have a steady-ish like carbon emissions or decrease, or we might be doing decently in that. There's still a lot of other factors like deforestation, pollution, and things like that, or just even depletion of fossil fuels or things like that. I think it's interesting that even if we have a decrease in CO2 emissions and we want to decouple that from economic growth, it's like there's still going to be other things that are affected negatively, possibly, from, economic growth. That is another whole realm that could be debated.
I'm so glad you brought that up because that is so true. I'm glad that climate change is getting worldwide attention, but it is not. It's not the only existential crisis that we face. When I interviewed Paul Ehrlich, the famous Stanford biologist who wrote The Population Bomb back in 1968 and is still at it today, actively researching and speaking and advocating for sustainability, even though he's in his 80s. He told me that he didn't think climate change was the most serious threat that we face.
I think it's one that affects the most people because it's something that's worldwide. Like you can say climate change will affect the whole globe. Well, environmental degradation, that we take resources from somewhere, it can maybe be almost ignored by some parts of the world. So it's like you don't think about it as much.
Maybe so, but the projections are that huge parts of the global population are going to be facing freshwater crises, for example. So we can power the world with renewable energy and we can keep growing our economy, but we haven't figured out a way to make water out of wine or whatever. We're going to face limits. We're pumping aquifers dry.
Well, it's so crazy because it's like people don't think about, California is such a dry state, and it's become even worse with droughts, and yet there's so much agriculture there and so much population growth. But then when you look at the actual environmental state of it, they are lacking water because they've been drought for so long. They have wildfires, and then like a lot of the resources that they use, like almond trees, take up so much water, but they still keep growing them in that area. Almonds are such a health trend, like almond milk, almond, yogurt and stuff. And even though I'm a pescatarian, I try to not drink or eat the almond products because I know the environmental impact of producing them because it takes so many gallons of water to produce one carton of almond milk. It's crazy.
What did you say you are?
I'm a pescatarian.
What's that?
I don't eat meat. I eat fish, and it's basically a vegetarian diet. But I became that because of environmental reasons of the CO2 impact of producing meat. And then I try to only eat sustainable fish. So I don't eat shrimp because it's bad for the environment with trolling and whatnot. But
so that's vegetarian plus fish?
Yeah, plus some select fish. But yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, side note.
Okay. And then last thing that we're ignoring, well, of the many, another major thing is that we're pushing other species off the planet at a fast rate. And powering the human race with renewable energy isn't going to change that. So there are a lot of things about us continuing to grow the scale of the human enterprise economically and just a number of bodies that have serious implications besides disrupting the climate. So I just want to say, I think bottom line for the conversation to me is that the shift to renewables is really critically important, but without us as individuals skinnying up our lives, and without us as a society giving up our obsession with everlasting economic growth, it won't be enough to ease the climate crisis or keep human civilization on the planet because of all these other crises that we talked about. Renewable energy is great, but we need so much more. Okay, so when we're getting close to wrap-up time, that means that we usually get to this segment we call Lightening the Load, where we share little, sometimes crazy things that we each are doing that, I don't know, makes me feel good about the way I live my life. I have a really silly one today, and I guess it's probably partly because we've had some house guests over the last few weeks, so I've been observing the behavior of other people, and even people who... This is something I do, but it's also a pet peeve about other people. What I do to skinny up my life and lighten the load is I recycle the cardboard tubes that the toilet paper comes on. Mm-hmm. Whoop-de-doo, big deal. Not really that significant, but I thought I'd bring it up because I see so many people who are recyclers, who do make a habit of putting the newspapers and magazines and office papers in the recycle bin, and yet they finish up a roll of toilet paper and they just throw that cardboard tube into the trash. Now, partly it might be because it used to be in the early days of recycling, a lot of the recycling centers couldn't handle what they call chipboard, that thin cardboard. And so cereal boxes and the tubes from your toilet paper you couldn't recycle. But that's pretty much a thing of the past. Now everybody can recycle chipboard, and that includes those tubes. And that's not a big deal. I don't know if you took all of the cardboard toilet paper tubes that get discarded in one day, it might not build a ladder to the moon. I don't know.
It could. It's a lot, I feel like.
It might be. And it's just, how hard is it to just put that thing in the recycle bin? And I think it's important because I just think lightening the load needs to be so front of mind for us that pretty much everything in the day, every opportunity to lighten the load just comes to us. It comes to us naturally. And clearly, we're not to that point yet. So, pet peeve.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I know a lot of my roommates necessarily, we have a recycling bin that's right by my door for some reason in my apartment at home. And my roommates will throw something away and the trash can's right next to it. And I'm just I will stare at them. I'll be like, what are you doing? like, move this, please. But yeah, I think it's interesting because the little things like that, people, I think they just don't think about it, honestly, especially when they're busy. They're just I'll just throw it away. Or the trash can in the bathroom's closer. But it is something to maybe be okay, just prod you a little bit, recycle that. Yeah, that could be like a paper bag if they went out for fast food, heaven forbid, just the paper bag. Unless it's contaminated with the food, it's recyclable. Yeah, crazy thoughts. But my lightning load for this week is whenever I go to the grocery store, I have these two little, I guess, collapsible, reusable bags that I just put in my purse because they're small. And I went to the grocery store with some family this weekend, and it was interesting because some of my family doesn't have that. And I was like, no, you can just put all your groceries in my bag. We'll just stuff them in. And then when we were in the checkout line at Walmart, the lady was like, you want all your stuff together? Because we had a shirt and some ice cream and stuff. I'm like, yes, we're putting it all together. And she just gave us the funniest look because first of all, I was telling my family, I was we're putting our stuff in this bag, which is kind of awkward when you have someone else filling it. And it was just strange circumstances. And then the lady comments on it. So I think we ended up carrying the ice cream because she was just really confused. But I was we used our reusable bags. There again, it adds up when it's multiplied by millions and millions of people. They double bag their stuff, which is, I was cringing the first time I went to the store. I ended up carrying my items and the people I was with did not. They were in front of me, so I didn't say anything. But when I was with them, I saw the bags they had and they double bagged the milk. And I was you can just hold the milk. It was 2 plastic bags around a milk jug. I was literally sitting in line cringing and I was just I'm in public. I can't say anything. But it was crazy how many plastic bags. There's probably 20 for maybe $50 worth of stuff. It was ridiculous. I think what's really mind-boggling about it is that there's so many people that just don't give it a thought. Mm-hmm. And including everyone who's bagging groceries. I mean, for the most part, they don't think twice about putting a couple things in a plastic bag. And they could easily put twice as much if they have to provide a customer with a plastic bag. They could put a few more things in a bag and double bag a few less things. It's definitely the culture of the area because different places I've went, it's very different because in Georgia, they also use a lot of bags. That's just how it is. And so here it's kind of like that in some areas, especially in the big box stores. But when I went to Seattle, in the city of Seattle, they've outlawed plastic bags altogether. And so they always say, thank you for bringing your like reusable bag. Like they will like make a note of being like, oh, this is good, because they just have their paper bags otherwise. But it's such a different thing that they're used to having the reusable bags because, you know, it's what everyone does. But in other areas, it's just like, oh, okay, just it is what it is. It's crazy.
I think we're making progress because I think I see this less often, but it really used to bug the heck out of me that let's say you buy a block of cheese and the grocery store clerk would just automatically, without thinking, toss that into a plastic bag. The cheese is already sealed up in plastic, and now you need a bag for it. Or you buy 2 apples, and they automatically put it in the bag. More and more often, they're asking if you want a bag, and I appreciate that. But we got a long way to go, and I think even it's important to get millions of people using no plastic or less plastic. But it's even more important to get millions of people thinking about these things every day, thinking about every action they take. Just a quick evaluation. It's not work, but just say, could I do this in a way with less impact? Could I combine these 2 trips today instead of making 1 trip this morning and 1 trip this afternoon, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, it's interesting because it reminds me of a philosophical idea. It's like utilitarianism, I think that's how you say it. It's an extreme way, and they kind of poke fun at it, but it's like you examine every decision you have in life, and you say, okay, what's the best for everyone? You have to examine, okay, what am I doing, and what does this mean? And it's interesting because whenever you take philosophy, they're saying, okay, that's excessive to do. It's like no one's going to say, if I brush my teeth, what will be the impact of doing this with this? Because it gets excessive. But I think people should take sort of maybe a step back and be like, okay, can I question some of the things I do, and can I take this approach of, okay, what does the impact of what I'm doing? Like you said, saying, okay, what can I do to change it, and just think about it.
Well, I didn't know there was a name for it, but that's really one of the things I'm campaigning to do.
It's a very extreme version, so you probably won't want to adopt the whole thing, but you could try it out.
Oh, I'm already there. I need therapy, I'm sure. Let's see. I'm in the garage. The garage is closed, and I have something in there, and I need to take it out to the front yard. I don't open the garage door because it's an electric garage door opener. The only thing I use that for is if I need to move a car in or out. If I need to carry some tools, some gardening tools or something out to the yard, I go through the house and open the door manually because every time you raise and lower that electric garage door, you are using some energy and you're using it unnecessarily. I try to do as much human-powered activity as I can.
Yeah, I feel like you might be going on the edge of that mindset.
I confess.
That's good, though. Good way to protect the environment.
True confessions. All right. Well, don't forget to explore issues at growthbusters.org. Subscribe to the podcast on your podcast app because you don't want to miss a single edition of just how totally insane Dave Gardner is. If you haven't seen the documentary Growthbusters Hooked on Growth, it's easy enough to find at growthbustersmovie.org or on Amazon. And on behalf of Dana and Dave, thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling.